Hi, how are you? Good morning.
Good morning,
Okay.
Professor Levitsky. How are you?
Good, how are you? It's good to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Sure.
Thanks for accepting our request to interview you.
Happy to do it. Thanks for being interested.
Thank you. Shall I start?
Yes, sure.
Uh, the first question is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and the leader of PIS in Poland, Mr. Kaczynski, have been building their liberal democracies for over a decade, with Italy governed by far-right winger Giorgia Meloni, Slovakian populist Robert Fico scoring a victory in last week's election, and the far-right alternative for Germany party rising fast in the polls. The signal is that right-wing populism is gaining strength across Europe. Don't you see a looming danger for democracies in Europe?
Sure. I mean, the only one of these cases that you've listed where democracies actually arguably broken down is Hungary. Right? Poland has backslid a little bit. Very competitive election next week in which the peace could find itself without a majority. It's not as if democracy has been extinguished in Poland. And in the other cases, Fico has governed 4 years without breaking democracy. In Slovakia, he won 23% of the vote and needs to form a coalition. So it's not like we're seeing a Hugo Chavezization of Slovakia. In Italy, I don't like the brotherhood, and there's obviously much to worry about, but it's a coalition government that has not threatened democracy. So the far right is pretty liberal in Europe, and of course there is much to worry about. But in terms of democracy breaking down, the record is actually, again, quite impressive. The only place in all the list that you just named where democracy is arguably broken down is Hungary.
All right.
So my main point is there's a difference between being worried about a changing scenario and declaring that democracy is actually breaking down. And we need to be clear about that difference.
All right. Despite the argument in your article, Democracy is Surprising Resilience, we witnessed the rise of far-right populism almost in each and every European country. How do you explain the rise of populism in Europe despite the terrible experience of Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin?
Two caveats. First of all, I'm not an expert on far-right populism in Europe. I study political parties in Argentina. I'm a Latin Americanist. I think there are pretty good explanations, pretty persuasive explanations that some combination of the economic anxiety generated by the 2008-2009 financial crisis and many of the economic changes that are going on globally, and maybe more persuasively, the rising ethnic diversity that has been brought about by migration has generated reaction among sectors of the electorate, particularly non-college educated, rural, white Christian sectors in Europe. This has happened everywhere in the industrialized world, including the United States. Some sector of the electorate, somewhere usually between 15 and 30% of the electorate, again, usually non-college educated, usually small town, more often male, more often white, has supported populist right-wing parties. Does that mean fascism is coming? I don't think we know that. Most far-right parties, Golden Dawn in Greece is a major exception, but most far-right parties in Europe thus far, even though I don't like them and don't agree with their policies, have played by democratic rules of the game. So I don't think that we can jump from the disturbing, I should say, disturbing rise of far-right parties in Europe to necessary threats to democracy. And certainly we should not jump to the sort of the imminence of fascism in the region. I frankly don't see that on the horizon.
All right. As a Turk myself, I want to ask you, You list Turkey as one of the three well-known backsliders, together with Hungary and Venezuela. President Erdogan wants to rewrite the constitution, and most people think his desire for a new constitution stems from the fact that he wants to be re-elected for the third time.
Sure.
Do you foresee a danger for Turkish democracy if he is elected for a third time?
The danger to Turkish democracy is already there. Turkey wasn't a democracy for very long, right? Prior to the late 1990s, the restrictions, the military's power and the restrictions on religious parties made Turkey less than democratic. It was briefly a full democracy in the late 90s and early 2000s, in the early years of the AKP, but it experienced backsliding, beginning in the first decade of the 21st century and dramatically after the 2016 failed coup. So Turkey is not a democracy today. I would call it a competitive authoritarian regime. It doesn't surprise me. So Erdogan is an autocrat. He is not fully consolidated authoritarian rule, and it doesn't surprise me that he's continuing to try to perpetuate himself in power. But what's interesting is the degree, or an interesting feature of Turkey is the degree of democratic pushback. Erdogan's inability to prevent the opposition from winning power in the major cities, the surprising for many competitiveness of the last election, despite the many advantages and tilted playing field that Erdogan had created. I have a very smart former graduate student who tells me if the opposition had nominated the mayor of Istanbul as his candidate, it probably would have won that election. And although Erdogan would almost certainly have tried many shenanigans to try to stay in power, there's a good chance that Erdogan would have had to cede power. So on the one hand, Turkey is a competitive authoritarian regime. On the other hand, the democratic pushback is such that elections remain really competitive. So I don't think the question is well framed in saying there's a danger to Turkish democracy. The danger's been there a long time, and Turkey's not a democracy. But I think that the opposition stands as good a chance of removing Erdogan in the coming years as Erdogan stands of obtaining another term. It's a pretty sort of evenly matched battle between an autocratic president and a pretty robust opposition.
All right. Coming to the United States, Professor Levitsky, Donald Trump wants to get re-elected. If he is re-elected, what sort of strains do you foresee on democracies all over the world? And after the speaker, Kevin McCarthy, was ousted by far-right Republicans, what do you foresee for American democracy?
American democracy is headed for some rough times. Again, I think it's very unlikely, given the strength of opposition forces, that we will see the consolidation of an autocracy in the United States, a Russian-style or even Hungarian-style autocracy. But we are very likely to see what we used to call an unconsolidated democracy, a very unstable regime sliding in and out of constitutional crisis, possibly periods of kind of weak authoritarianism and maybe some. I would not be surprised to see a fair amount of political violence, given the level of extremism and the number of guns in the country. So the biggest problem is the Republican Party, which is largely abandoned democratic rules of the game. We see that in its willingness to continue to support Donald Trump, even though he tried to overturn the results of an election. So if Trump wins, the U.S. will undoubtedly slide into another democratic crisis. There will be an authoritarian attempt. I think it'll be much worse than last time because I think Trump didn't expect to be president. Trump didn't really have a plan for sort of purging and packing the state the way that Erdogan and Orban did. But this time he will. And so he'll make a much more serious, I don't know if successful, but a much more serious effort to purge the state and pack state institutions and politicize institutions in a way that we are now familiar with in other cases of elected authoritarianism. And I think it will be a terrible signal, and it have a terrible impact for democracies across the world. Trump, we already saw this in many cases in between 2016 and 2021. Countries like El Salvador and Honduras and even Nicaragua, where autocrats were processes of autocratization were winked at by the United States, not opposed by the United States. Emerging autocrats feeling emboldened by Trump, copying Trump in his style in attacking the press, for example, or in denying the results of elections. Not long after Trump rejected the results of the elections, there were copycat efforts in Peru and in Brazil. So what happens in the United States is I mean, it matters in two ways, right? First of all, people across the world look at the United States as a model. And so if it's okay to be an autocrat in the United States, that will embolden autocrats elsewhere. And also US foreign policy will change. The Biden administration could do much, much more to promote democracy, but at least it is has been relatively active behind the scenes in opposing autocratic behavior. We see this now in Guatemala today. We saw this in Brazil after the election. The Biden administration did the right thing and pressured autocratic forces to back off. If Trump is in office, that will disappear, and you'll see an open support in some cases for autocrats. So I think a Trump election will have very, very negative consequences for democracy in the world.
United States is the oldest democracy in the world, Professor.
No, it's not.
It's not?
No. The United States extended full suffrage to its citizens in 1965. Its democracy is 50-something years old. I think New Zealand is older. There's several other democracies that are older.
All right. Okay.
Oldest constitution in the world.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. How does the presence of big state institutions in low and middle income countries with authoritarian tendencies hinder the consolidation of authoritarian rule? How do you explain the role
in
of
a couple of ways? I'm sorry, I should let you finish.
Yeah.
What's the last sentence?
The question was, how do you explain the role of same weak institutions which have been observed as key factors contributing to insufficient democratic resilience against authoritarianism in cases like Turkey, Serbia, Hungary, in contrary to the case of US and Brazil?
I'm not sure I understand the last sentence. So I understand the sentence about weak state institutions.
Yes, indeed. How do you explain the role of these same weak institutions?
Well, Turkey doesn't have such weak institutions. Turkey's got relatively strong institutions. What are the other cases you listed? Serbia?
Yeah, and Hungary.
Hungary also has quite strong institutions. When I talk about weak institutions, I'm talking about Ukraine. I'm talking about Albania, Benin, Honduras, Zambia, Malawi. Those are countries with weak state institutions. Turkey and Hungary have relatively strong institutions. Serbia, a little bit less, but not terribly weak. Look, I think we tend to think when democracies fail, and the third wave of democracies, you know, extended democracies, or at least electoral politics, further than ever before in history, much further than ever before in history. So democracy arrived in places where not only it had never existed before, but where it's pretty hard to sustain. Very poor countries, very unequal countries with very weak state institutions. Nicaragua, Benin, Albania, Mali, Malawi. These are countries where every social science theory in existence would predict that democracy would have a hard time surviving. And it's true, democracy has had a hard time surviving in countries like that. But the point that we make in the article is that authoritarianism has a hard time consolidating in many countries with weak states as well, for at least two reasons. First of all, where the state is weak, governments have a hard time getting state officials to do what they want them to do. So that's a problem for democracies, because democratic governments have a hard time implementing and enforcing their policies and providing public goods. But it's problematic for autocrats too, because when they want to steal an election, for example, they have a hard time getting bureaucrats and low-level state officials to go along with them. Or when they want to repress or spy on opponents, they have a hard time getting state institutions to go along with them. And we've seen that notoriously, for example, in Ukraine, where, as my co-author Lucan Wei has shown, autocrats repeatedly have failed to consolidate power. I'm talking about people like Yanukovych, precisely because they couldn't get the state to go along. So when the state is weak, autocrats have a hard time enforcing their power. The other problem with weak states is that governments govern badly when the state is weak. When the state is weak, governments have a hard time providing security. They have a hard time with, say, the pandemic, with education policy. All of the policies that people care about are made difficult when you have weak institutions. So what does that mean for autocrats? It means that autocrats become unpopular. It means people turn against autocratic governments the same way that they turn against democratic governments. And if as long as elections are held, it means that autocrats are going to have a hard time winning. And so we've seen, whether it's Sri Lanka or Nepal or Honduras or Peru or Ecuador or Bolivia or Ukraine or Zambia or Malawi, autocratic leaning governments failing, losing elections, even losing unfair elections, because people are angry at the poor performance of the government, and the poor performance of the government is rooted in state weakness. And so democracy is certainly very vulnerable in lower and middle income countries, but in many of these countries, particularly ones that don't have oil, autocracies also prove very vulnerable, and you see them lasting 7, 8, 10 years and then falling.
All right. The next question is, you have extensively analyzed the influence of internal factors and the general international political climate on democratic backsliding and democratic resilience. Do you believe that well-coordinated efforts of authoritarian states such as Russia, China, and Iran to export their authoritarian or illiberal governance style through various economic, political, diplomatic, and technological means and projects play a significant role in this process?
I think the claim that you just made is overstated. I don't think that there is much effective coordination among China, Russia, and Iran. Those are three very different states with very different interests and very different activities. The idea that all of those states are opposed to the liberal West and seek to balance out the power of the United States, so they do work together and have an interest in limiting and thwarting U.S. power. There's no question about that. And they have at times supported autocratic governments, but they're not particularly well coordinated. They're not particularly effective. Russia in particular has mostly failed in its effort to, even in neighboring countries like Ukraine, to prop up, or Georgia, to prop up authoritarian allies. So there's an element of your argument that I completely agree with, which is that the shift in the global balance of power away from US and European hegemony in the 1990s to a much more multipolar world in which the United States and Europe are weaker and less influential, China and Russia and other powers are more powerful. That's a real challenge for democracy. That dramatically limits the United States' willingness and ability to promote democracy in the global South, and it almost certainly will lead to some erosion of global democracy. But I think we overstate if we say that there's a well-coordinated effort among these states. And again, thus far, the degree of democratic survival despite this pretty dramatic shift towards a multipolar world in which the United States is much, much weaker than it was 30 years ago. The fact that we've had so much geopolitical change in a way that is unfavorable to liberal democracy, and yet we only have 5, 6 fewer democracies than we had 15 years ago, is pretty surprising. So it's a real threat. I don't think we should overstate the threat. And so far, the consequences of that threat have been surprisingly modest.
Okay. Is it possible that the experience of democratic backsliding is experienced at different levels in different countries, contexts? A small change shown in data might have a greater local and global impact if experienced in certain geographies. So even though the data shows resilience, is it possible that the experience of civilians in everyday life change catastrophically?
Sure, it's possible. Catastrophically sounds like, again, overstated, sounds exaggerated. You'd have to show me catastrophic changes for civilians for me to be persuaded. But yeah, sure, it's possible that the situation is worse than the data suggests, but I think we should start with the data. And looking at my critique of much of the sort of world of democracy promoters, especially VDEM in recent years, is I think that they are just overstating the case. You know, VDEM, before it classified India as an electoral autocracy, I think they made that change in 2017 or 2019. Before that, they focused on the number of democracies and they downplayed per capita, the number of people in the world living under democracy. When India shifted to electoral autocracy, suddenly VDEM is trumpeting not the number of democracies in the world, but per capita numbers. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because they want to highlight and even exaggerate the degree of autocratization in the world. I just think we need to be more careful and balanced with the data. And I'm concerned that there's been almost a lemming-like rush to declare the world in democratic recession, to focus almost exclusively on the cases of backsliding, which are real. They're very real, but they're not the only thing happening in the world. I think a more balanced look at the data, and we need to continue to evaluate the data. And it's possible that it's certainly possible. The answer to your question is yes, of course it's possible that that it may be worse than the data suggests. But I think we need to look in a serious and balanced way at the data. And our take is a serious and balanced look at the data suggests modest backsliding over the last 15 years, not dramatic backsliding.
Mm-hmm. All right. You suggest that if wealth, education, and urbanization continue to grow, authoritarian vulnerabilities may intensify. However, we have observed a different outcome in both Russian and Chinese contexts, as well as in regimes supported by them. Could these cases be considered exceptions to the general trend you have discussed?
When I evaluate regimes, I look at the capacity of autocrats to monopolize resources and to control society. I've written a book that argues that regimes born of violent revolution, like China, are likely to be very durable. So and it's also been demonstrated that regimes that sustain high levels of economic growth, and China's economy is not what it used to be, but it's still a reasonably strong performer. Regimes that perform well economically are likely to survive. So revolutionary regimes presiding over economic growth, Vietnam and China, are in the medium term in pretty decent shape. Regimes with a lot of energy resources, oil and gas resources like Russia, are also likely to be in pretty good shape because they can monopolize resources. And that counters the impact of modernization. The civil society in Russia, despite it being a relatively wealthy country, a relatively educated country, civil society in Russia is incredibly weak because the Russian state monopolizes or controls so many resources. So Russia and China, I think they're pretty easily explained. What we're the claim that we finish with focuses mostly on countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America that are sort of moving in the African case, are urbanizing quite rapidly and moving into lower middle income status. So they're no longer, there are a handful of countries like Burundi and Mali that are very, very poor. But we're seeing in Kenya and Senegal and Ghana, elsewhere, an important degree of modernization that makes autocratization more difficult. In Latin America, we're seeing in Central Europe and in Southern Europe, we've already seen in South America the graduation of countries into sort of upper middle income status with large civil societies, developed private sectors, and robust oppositions. That doesn't make authoritarianism impossible, but it makes it much less likely. And so the transformation that we've seen first in Southern Europe, more recently in Central Europe and in South America, where you now have overwhelmingly urban societies in most cases, with large diversified private sectors and robust civil societies. Again, none of that makes democratic breakdown impossible. None of it makes democracy invulnerable, but it makes it much, much harder to consolidate authoritarian rule. And in all those cases, South America, Central Europe, Southern Europe, the two cases where you see real autocratization are Venezuela, which has a ton of oil money, and Hungary, which is a real outlier. Hungary is one case that really theory predicts should not be an autocracy, and it is. But the degree, the softness of the Hungarian regime, the fact that the regime doesn't lock up anybody, doesn't kill anybody, doesn't ban anybody, the fact that elections are still competitive, suggests that regime also may not consolidate long term. So China and Russia there are good reasons why China and Russia are authoritarian. The world is not going to we're not predicting democratization across the world in the short or medium term, particularly in countries, again, with very statist economies, very poor societies, or a lot of oil, or revolutionary origins. Those are regimes that there's good reason to expect to be stably authoritarian. But much of the world, from the Baltics to Central Europe to South America to parts of East Asia, levels of economic development are such that Democrats now stand a fighting chance in many, many, many more places than was the case at the beginning of the third wave.
Right. And lastly, Professor, in your famous book, How Democracies Die, you wrote, I quote, 1990-2015 period was easily the most democratic quarter century in the world history, partly because Western powers broadly supported democracy. That may now be changing, end of the quote. Do you still think so? Is that change unfolding?
Yeah, unfortunately, but also inevitably, the Western dominance of the initial third wave period, the extraordinary Western liberal hegemony of the period between the fall of the Berlin Wall, or maybe Perestroika, and the Iraq War, which is, I think, if you want to date sort of the beginning of the U.S. crisis, let's date it in the first decade of the 21st century. The extraordinary liberal hegemony of 1989 to 2003, that's gone. That's eroding. It's going to continue to erode. We're moving in a multi, and the United States, both the United States and Europe, but especially the United States, have accelerated Western liberal decline through its own errors and its own internal conflicts and strife. The US democracy is becoming almost dysfunctional, which makes it very, very difficult to promote or defend liberal democracy in the world. So this process of a declining liberal West and its inability and really increasing unwillingness to promote democracy is a real challenge in the world. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any going back to the world of 1990 to 2003, when democracy in many respects was almost the only game in town. Those days are over. It's a much, much more challenging world.
Professor, thank you so very much for your time.
Sure, my pleasure.
Okay.
Best of luck to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.